The latest study data from Richard. We would like to ask our next live voting question. Ladies and gentlemen, you have devices on your seats, remote control devices to give the answers. Can I now have the question for our next live voting? The question is, what percentage of international tourists will let safety considerations impact their choice of holiday travel 2017? Please just give one answer. You can vote 30%, number 1, 50%, number 2, 70%, number 3, and 90%, number 4. Please vote now with your remote control on your seat. Okay, the majority is 70%, and then 50, and then 30, and 90 is ranked 4th. Richard, let's see. We are very excited to hear the real data.
Thank you. Hi there, good afternoon everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So you may have guessed, but I'm from Scotland, so if you would like this presentation in English, please flick to channel number 2. So, Professor Conradi, it's reciprocal. It's always a pleasure to work with you. This is the 3rd year running that we've worked together, so it's really a great topic that we will be discussing, and a very important topic. But before I start, a quick 2 seconds. This is who Travelzoo. Hopefully many of you will be familiar. We have 28 million members worldwide. We are the world's leading travel deals website, and we work with over 2,000 travel companies, and we generate around 250,000 deals every single year for those members. So that's who Travelzoo is, and I run the European business. But here today, we're to talk about safety and security in travel, and it is a very important topic, and it was fascinating listening to the panel before us, just to hear some of their views in terms of this. But you can see here, a selection of things that have happened really over the last 15 years within our industry that we operate in. And you can see the amount that have actually happened has sped up over the last few years. And even today, it's very much in the news with TUI and the coroner inquest that recently happened. And even here in Berlin, they suffered a terrible tragedy at the back end of last year. So it is an important topic, and it's an important topic because it impacts a huge amount of people involved in the tourism industry, whether it's some of the leading travel companies within Europe and within worldwide, or whether what we've already seen is the devastation that's left behind of some of these tourism markets that are so dependent on tourism, and how they've been affected and how they'll recover ultimately going forward. But it's also changed the way that people travel. People are resilient, the tourism industry is resilient, but certainly some areas like Egypt, Tunisia, Turkey have seen significant drops over the last year because of that. But ultimately there's always winners in travel, and it's about finding new destinations, but we can already see longer haul. Greece, Mediterranean, Western Mediterranean are areas where we're seeing that increase, and you saw that from the panel very clearly just before me. But I think it's also important to stress, and this comes back to perception, is that the terrorist incidents, so these activities are really happening at a local level. And more and more people are traveling, more people want to see the world. The risks are still very, very, very small for things to happen. And that's why what's positive is we're definitely seeing people continuing to travel. So it is an important topic, and it was one that we were very keen to understand how people felt in this current climate. And so to do that, we worked with Bournemouth University, one of the leading travel universities in Europe, and also with Norstat Research to provide an independent survey to 9 of the largest travel markets. And you can see them up here on the screen. So China, Japan, India, Russia, Within Europe, it was UK, Germany, and France, and also the USA. And ultimately, it was 6,000 people, over 6,000 people from those 9 markets. And what we really wanted to understand are, what are their concerns around safety and security? And specifically, these 4 concerns, which have really been in the news and really come to the fore of people's minds. So, terrorism, disasters such as earthquakes and tsunamis, disease. Zika virus has certainly become far more prominent and much more of a topic, and severely impacted some very popular destinations around the world, and ultimately crime, whether that's at a local level or at a national level. And it's probably no surprise to many of you that terrorism really play the highest profile within this, and it's the one that we will focus the majority of this survey and presentation on. There are quite a few slides on this, and I've already seen a number of you with cameras and phones at the ready, so by all means do that. What I would say is at the very end, I've got an email address to show you. So we can send these slides, we can send the white paper and the results to you. So you don't need to take photos, but definitely email the email address at the end. So what are the perceived safe and unsafe destinations? And this is quite a difficult one to actually really categorize, is what is a safe destination when the reality is nowhere is 100% safe. And I think a key point is, what can the industry do to make people feel safer? And these are really recommendations at the very end that we will come to. So it's fair to say, in putting these things into context, terrorism is not new in our lives. For some of the British people here, then it's been 30 years of terrorism, where over 3,500 British people have been killed over that period. 800 Spanish nationals by the ETA, so it's not a new thing, but it's really coming to a high priority now. So the question there is, how much is safety and security on travelers' minds? I think in the question that Professor Conradi asked there, 12% of you said 90%, and that 12% is correct. So 97% of all people surveyed in this rate safety and security on their mind when selecting a holiday destination to either some extent or to a great extent. So this is 97%. So congratulations to you who were in the 12%. And really, what concerns people the most? You can see there, South Africa is very high on crime, but definitely unanimously, with the exception of South Africa, terrorism is the number 1 concern for people when they're selecting a holiday. And ultimately, what safety and security is a greater concern than in 2014. So what are the trends happening? And we picked 2014 just as a benchmark a few years back. And you can see there well over 70% of people within all of these markets rate safety and security a much greater concern. And the perception is the world feels like a more dangerous place. And I manage that in terms of the perception, because we've seen actually in terms of the atrocities that have happened is actually less over this period of time. But certainly the perception is it's a more dangerous place. And the reason for that is we have a new face of terror. These are activities and atrocities that are happening in places where people go to spend their time. They could be relaxing on the beach, they could be listening to music in a nightclub, they could be spending time at a Christmas festival. This is the reason why people are actually feeling more anxious, and this is why it's really had a massive impact on tourism. So this is the new face of terror, and obviously the news exacerbates these feelings and perceptions of insecurity. And so which nations feel the most targeted and at risk of terror attacks around the world? You can see there, I'm probably a little surprised to you given what the country has gone through over the last 18 months, but France certainly is the country at nearly 58% feel they are most at risk when they're abroad. Quickly followed by Japan, and again, where their proximity and their relations with places like China and places with North Korea, then that clearly makes sense. And then the USA are third. South Africa feel quite at ease in the world when they travel. But this is the good thing, and this really is testament to the travel industry and to travelers. This has to be kept in perspective, because you can see there how many people are actually being deterred from traveling abroad, despite these fears, and the digits and the percentage are incredibly low. So in the UK, it's 4% of people who have really rethought their travel plans. Germany is slightly more at 6%, and again, we see consistently through this research, the market like Japan is the most cautious in terms of how they feel about traveling abroad. And then we talk about buyer's regret. So at the time of researching, we actually identified people who had already booked their holiday either this coming summer or were due to go on holiday. And what you can see there is these are the people who, since booking their holiday, have thought to themselves, I'm not sure if I want to go to that particular destination or I want to take that holiday. Within the USA, 24% and 12% of those were people who had booked and have since then considered not going on holiday. So this is what we're terming buyer's regret. So this is about future holidays. The key message there for the travel industry is it's not just about communication and information in the lead up to booking, which has certainly become a much higher topic since the Tunisia inquest and what role tour operators or travel agents or product owners provide. But this really shows that even the people who have booked need to be very carefully managed, and because they're still going through the same concerns about their future holiday. So I think it's a good learning for us as an industry. And this is a big slide. So in very simple terms, which countries and cities are tourists most fearful of visiting? Essentially, yellow is good, and blue is less good. So where you have the number one safest place would be Sydney, coupled with that Australia, and that's probably because of the proximity, its track record, its involvement in general geopolitical politics. People rank that very highly. And then you go to the other spectrum where Turkey is unfortunately one of the most prominent tourism destinations for European travelers over the last decade, but you can see there now it's really had an impact because of the unstable environment there, but also the number of incidents that have happened within that particular market. It's good to see countries and areas such as the UAE with Abu Dhabi and Dubai really being seen as a safe destination. They've done a huge amount of work to portray that as a family destination. And again, you can see the impact of that, which is about messaging and communication about what's safe. You look then at somewhere like London or Paris, which London is a risk of severe risk of terrorism, and Paris clearly has suffered the most in the last 18 months, but they're still deemed very safe. And this is a slight dichotomy with information and also perception, is that it's a very familiar places. They believe that there's good security in these areas, and that's why they're still deemed popular destinations to go to. And then we talk about major city phobia. So Japan, as you might expect, would deem somewhere like Beijing somewhere where they fear the most of going. Incidentally, that's not reciprocated because, as you'll see in some of the pen portraits, the Chinese travelers rate Japan one of the safest places to go to. So it's definitely not reciprocal. But again, unfortunately, you can see there, Istanbul across the board is deemed one of the most unsafe by all markets. China is pretty good with most of the countries, and the UK would certainly rate Paris just behind Istanbul. So then we get into risk versus price. You will hear a lot in the industry is, okay, well, it might have a risk, but actually if you lower the price by an amount of money, people will come. And in a lot of cases, that is correct up to a particular point. So the question around this was, if there's two particular holidays which are equally appealing, one has a risk, the other one doesn't, but the other one is cheaper by around about £100 per person, would you go there? And what you can see there is nearly 60% of these markets, America, US, China would certainly go. So yes, price does make a difference, and people are prepared to accept the risk, even if it's a small risk or some form of risk. But then up to that point, what we found was no amount of money or discounting would encourage the other 40% to go to that destination. So I think it's quite a lazy response to say, okay, well, just lower the price, make it cheap, people will come. It's much more than that. You will get more, but you certainly won't appeal to all people within the industry. Sorry, within tourism. And then we talk about how quickly can destinations recover following terror attacks, outbreaks, disease, or natural disasters. So we saw things like the Bali bombing, which very quickly recovered. And then you see areas such as Tunisia, which clearly is taking a long time to recover. Paris is significantly down. So what is it that makes one destination recover faster than the other? And I touched on it really before with the places like London and like Paris still deemed a safe destination despite what's happening. And there's a whole load of different factors in there. It's about perception, it's about what the local governments are doing, it's about the news, it's about familiarity, it's about how you can travel there. It's a very complex topic to sum up in one particular slide around what makes something recover faster than other markets. But we asked these people in these countries, how likely is it you would return, or would you book a holiday if there's been some form of attack in a destination in the past 10 years? And 4 would mean very unlikely, and 1 would be very likely that they would return. And you can see that there's a huge amount of work that needs to happen to move people. But certainly India, Germany, USA, very open to returning to go back to a destination. But the further up you get of Russia and Japan, the less likely they are to return in any great pace. So those are the kind of top line findings. I've got some pen portraits of individuals of all of those different markets. So I could go through all of these, but it might be helpful if would anybody like to see the results of a particular country? So we can start with Germany as we're here. So this defines German tourists with regards to these traits. So 50% would blame the travel company if they book with if things go wrong. You can see the perceived safest places, and you can also see the most dangerous places that they regard. So German tourists would regard Turkey as the most dangerous place to travel to at the moment, and then Switzerland, their close neighbour, as one of the safest places, which they would be right with Switzerland. It's one of the few countries in Europe that has a low threat rating. So clearly German people do much more of their research. Has anybody got another country that they would like me to have a look at? France. We've got France and Russia. Okay, let's go to Russia. Let's go to Russia, and then we'll go to France. Russians are probably one of the most cautious travelers at the moment in terms of destinations, and least likely to grab a bargain if they were one of the hardest markets that you would be able to encourage to travel if there was some form of risk. Ukraine is the most dangerous place for them to travel to, but they like Belarus and Finland. Shall we go to France? As we already mentioned, they feel that they're one of the most targeted nations when they travel abroad, but actually one of the most resilient in terms of continuing to travel. They like Portugal, Canada, Italy, Spain, and Belgium, and Egypt is one of those areas where they feel is one of the most dangerous places. They do very little preparation before a trip. US? No problem, we do US, thank you. We saw already 24% already worried about trips they've booked of those people who have already booked a holiday for next year. And you can see there, but they're one of the largest tourism individuals who are happy to go back to a holiday after a scene of a natural disaster 3 years on. UK, Mr. Taylor, my pleasure. There you go, Ian. Again, 51% would blame the travel company if something went wrong. They don't take many precautions to maximize the safety abroad. Australia, safest place, and Tunisia, which, given what's been in the news over the last few months, probably not a surprise. Again, I can share all of these with you as we progress. Okay. So what we spoke about is how can the travel industry actually improve how we operate. And one of the big things that we saw within this research was who would the consumer blame if something went wrong, and it's over 40% of consumers would actually blame the company that sold them the product. And so you can see quite clearly from the things like the Tunisia inquest and the coroner's inquest is that this is now going to go on, but a lot of litigation will happen. And I think it's an important thing for us as a travel industry to recognize that it's very easy to say, well, look at government advice or understand the risks, but actually 40% of consumers within every single market would blame the product, the company that sold them the product. So we said that there's a number of ways to improve, and these are based on destination, but they're also based on actual assets such as hotels, attractions, where people go to and where people actually enjoy their free time. So the 3 ways to improve based on this research is clearer travel advice from official sources like government websites. And yes, if you take the UK as an example, we would always say go to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office website, which will show you details around that particular destination and what's happened there, and whether it's at one of 1, 2, 3, or 4 categories of terror threat, and we'll come to that. We've also talked about more proactive, more transparent, more consistent use of that information to consumers so that they're aware of the risk of that destination before they book. And then finally, we talked about a standard approach of certification of security standards to give a perception, or at least a reassurance to the consumer. So this is what we mean by clearer travel advice. If you go to most of the government websites to understand, okay, well, should I go to that country? Is Tunisia safe? Is Turkey safe? Is UK? Is Germany? Is the USA safe? You can see there from high threat that there's not many places in the world that you can go to. And it's very easy to say, okay, well, you're thinking of booking a holiday to Spain. Do you realize that's a high terror threat? It's the same threat level that was on Tunisia when both of the attacks happened. So I think it's the travel industry needs to kind of sharpen up as to how we use this information. I mean, ultimately, responsibility is with the consumer about the choice that they make, but it's quite clear that this sort of information is open to interpretation. It's quite difficult to understand, and it doesn't really aid the decision-making process. Coupled with that is responsible and proactive communication. So from our survey, we saw that less than 25% of British people actually use the Foreign Office website, and less than 16% of German people would go to a government source of information. And what we mean about responsible and proactive communication is allowing people that information in a way that they can understand, that they can see the risks, and they can judge their decision based on that. And so it's where and how that information is presented, and also what agents talk about. And that's quite a big job to explain to somebody from a company, okay, how do you interpret Foreign Office information and give that to the consumer in the way that they can do it. But it's also telling it from the travel industry today that, as a UK customer, I can go into one of the largest online travel agents in the world, and I can type in a selection for a holiday to Sousse in Tunisia, and I could book this, but at no point does it say to me, as a UK customer, you basically have no insurance and you're not validated to travel there. And I think as an organization, we definitely have to sharpen up in that. It's good that TUI, obviously, who have been through the inquest, and they're clearly one of the largest travel companies in Europe, have now started to display this information, not post-booking, but in pretty much every step of the booking process. And that change of when you have one of the best companies and largest companies doing that, it becomes a standard for the rest of the industry to follow. So the second part of that is about responsible and transparent information. And then the final one, which is much more around how do you answer the question when a customer telephones the hotel and it says, okay, well, what have you done to ensure I'm going to be safe actually in that hotel? And I think from the research that we did with hoteliers and with the trade, it's a very mixed security standard that we have. And I would see this as something very similar to what you have in Germany with TÜV. You have ISO accreditation of health standards across Europe, but also we have things like a blue flag if the beaches are clean based on EU standards. Now, this 100% does not mean somebody is going to be totally protected from a terrorist attack. But if you take something like a hotel, which I believe is quite an obvious one to begin with, this standard, which would be a pass and a fail, would be based on whether this hotel has gone through vulnerability checks, whether there's people who are trained in proactive behavioral awareness, that they can sense suspicious behavior, that there's potentially security there, that there's maybe physical assets around the property. And I think what happens there is that gives a sense of reassurance and an explanation that when somebody asks, what are you going to do about my safety? How can you ensure that I'm going to be safe? That there is a standard through which people have. Now, this standard, Travelzoo are not security and certification and standard experts, but I would really see this being led by the industry bodies within the country. It would be with security experts, and also you would expect to see a representation of trade people, so a group of hoteliers who could do that. That would be an effective way of doing that. The second part is I could also see a company like Thomas Cook or TUI developing this for their brands. So if you book a TUI, a First Choice, or a Thompson holiday, we can say that actually it has this standard which is based on these criteria. So when somebody says, what are you going to do to ensure my safety? Then clearly what happens is that they can reference this. It really doesn't make anybody 100% safe, but it means that the plans are in place to do that. And if there's a choice between a hotel that has a standard and a hotel that doesn't, then clearly that hotel is going to win in the current climate. So very briefly on the conclusion, what you've seen today is safety and security is now the most important consideration when choosing a holiday for all major tourism markets. Terrorism, as you've seen, is the #1 perceived risk, but ahead of disease, crime, and natural disaster. This third point is, and this is really critical, why we as an industry have to address this, and we can't hide behind government advice or wait for other people to follow, is that consumers look to and ultimately hold responsible the travel industry and the owner of those products for guidance. So in conclusion, there is an opportunity for us to develop a better framework for information regarding safety and risk, both in terms of the type of information, the clarity, when it's presented, how it's presented, and also pioneering travel companies and destinations should see this as one of the most important opportunities to build trust. That is time up. 16:45, thank you very much.
Richard, thank you very much for these really unique